Tensions have risen on the Korean Peninsula as U.S.-South Korea joint military drills continue. The massive exercises are aimed at demonstrating the Allies' capabilities of projecting military power through the movement of troops and equipment.
Pacific Reach is a defense-oriented bilateral training event designed to ensure readiness and sustain the capabilities which strengthen our ironclad ROK U.S. alliance. This exercise is yet another example of our ability to flawlessly execute expeditionary logistics capabilities that can be employed worldwide.
The U.S. has rerouted the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson strike group to the vicinity, diverting the vessels from Australia. Following Pyongyang's more recent nuclear and missile tests, the U.S. has increased military pressure on North Korea and pushed through stronger sanctions at the UN.
The South Korean and U.S. governments argue that joint military drills like Key Resolve and Full Eagle should be reinforced in order to solve the North Korean nuclear issue, but means of military pressure has been an obstacle, not a solution. The next administration will need to pursue new measures for solving the nuclear issue through dialogue and negotiation, not means of military pressure.
In response to the U.S. military moves, North Korea has said it's ready for war as soldiers rallied in Pyongyang in support of leader Kim Jong-un. North Korea this week honors the birth anniversary of founder Kim Il-sung, which falls on April 15th. Pyongyang says the deployment proves the U.S. aggression against Pyongyang has entered a serious phase. The ongoing joint U.S.-South Korea military exercises come as Seoul prepares to hold a presidential election on May 9th. Despite the ongoing tension on the Korean Peninsula, leading candidates in that election pledged to hold dialogue and engagement with Pyongyang. Frank Smith, Press TV, Pohang, South Korea.
Vinson strike group, which includes a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, was initially meant to be headed to Australia. Its new route is seen as a show of force from the US, which is also putting pressure on regional powers. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says China has agreed action must be taken. Andrew Thomas reports from the border between China and North Korea.
In a parallel imaginary 2017, this is a busy bridge. Instead, it's deserted. On the Chinese side, a customs building is idle. In North Korea, the bridge dissolves into fields. The bridge was built to be a sign of normality and North Korean openness, but those dreams burst. Today, the bridge is a symbol, but one of North Korea's isolation. And the river is nearly as empty as the bridge. Until recently, boats carrying coal were a common sight. But in February, in response to a North Korean missile test, China said it was suspending coal imports from its neighbour. On Sunday, swimmers were easier to spot. Some trucks are still crossing another bridge upstream, but the United States wants this trade to stop too. It thinks China should punish North Korea more for its continuing missile tests, even cutting all economic ties. But that could carry risks.
Instead of persuading North Korea to give up nuclear weapons, you may cause a collapse of North Korean government. That would create a chaotic situation as well as a huge humanitarian disaster.
In Dandong, people agree. Few here feel threatened by North Korea. Many have connections with their neighbour which date from the Korean War.
It's impossible to completely shut down trade because our men shed their blood in that land. My father fought for that country.
I'm not worried about North Korea. China is so big and strong now. They're not a threat.
Last Friday, Donald Trump told Xi Jinping that without new ideas from China, the US was prepared to chart its own course. A sign of that came over the weekend as it sent warships towards the Korean peninsula. Whether North Korea over there sees US ship movements as provocative could become clear on Tuesday when its Supreme People's Assembly holds a rare meeting. A big parade set for next Saturday in Pyongyang could also be a moment for Kim Jong-un to react. China wants both sides to stop provoking the other. It's long urged strategic patience towards North Korea, but US patience is fast running out. Andrew Thomas, Al Jazeera, Dandong on China's border with North Korea.
Well, the US is keeping tabs on North Korea because the recent missile launch is just the latest step in its nuclear program. In 1998, Pyongyang launched a multi-stage long-range missile over Japan into the Pacific Ocean, calling it a satellite launch. 8 years later, it test-fired a second missile and conducted its first nuclear test. Over the past decade, North Korea has conducted 3 other nuclear tests and launched more than 18 missiles. Then last September, it fired 3 more ballistic missiles, one of which entered Japan's air defense zone. It also said it successfully conducted its 5th nuclear test. And last week, North Korea fired a ballistic missile into the sea off its east coast. Well, this sparked the US response we're seeing today. So let's bring in our guest now to talk about what happens next. In Seoul, we have Jean Lee, Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And in Boston, Jim Walsh, a Research Associate at MIT's Security Studies Program. Great to have you both with us. Jim, first of all, can you explain to us what this US Navy deployment consists of and the message that it sends?
Well, it's the aircraft carrier, the Carl Vinson, and because aircraft carriers tend to be vulnerable when they're these big boats in the ocean by themselves, there's a set of other destroyers and other ships that travel with them to protect them. As to the message, I think it's one of 2 things. It's either reassurance to the U.S. ally South Korea, in other words, another way for a powerful a country to say to its ally, don't worry, we've got your back. I actually don't think it's reassurance because we do these big military exercises every year. I mean, we do all sorts of things already to reassure the South Koreans. It's probably deterrence, which is to say to try to dissuade North Korea from conducting a nuclear test this upcoming Saturday.
Well, Jean, perhaps you can help us out there. Is this reassuring to South Koreans to see this this deployment moving back into the Western Pacific?
Well, South Koreans, to be honest, the people are largely unfazed as they usually are. This is seasonal. As Jim mentioned, we have these joint military exercises every spring going on here on the South Korean peninsula. That said, it certainly was a talking point from in the government and among presidential candidates who don't like, it's not so much the arrival of the Carl Vinson, but don't like the talk of a preemptive military strike as a possibility. That is what makes them nervous.
Jean, why are we seeing this posturing now? What is the actual threat level that we're seeing from North Korea?
Well, the concern is, of course, that North Korea, the pace of North Korea's development of its nuclear weapons and its ballistic missiles has been surprising and worrying. Now, North Korea, the leader of North Korea stated very clearly on New Year's Day this year that he would get an intercontinental ballistic missile into the air. And this is a missile that is designed to strike the United States. And very clearly has said he wants to get enough hydrogen bombs small enough to mount on one of these missiles. And so this is the pairing of these 2 technologies that experts and scientists have been concerned about. And the pace of the test launches is certainly unprecedented.
I'm pleased to say we can now bring in Victor Gao from Beijing. Victor is director of the China National Association of International Studies. Great to have you along with us, Victor. We've got the US showing here that it means business. What is China's response to this naval deployment?
No, I think what the United States is doing, moving its military forces, including several aircraft carrier groups, to areas closer and closer to the Korean Peninsula, is really alarming. And since the United States launched the unilateral Tomahawk missile attack against the Syrian government Air Force just a few days ago, it is even more alarming now to see whether the United States may actually take unilateral military action this time against DPRK. I think from the Chinese perspective, the Chinese government has repeatedly mentioned that we do not want to have war or confrontation or military conflict taking place just by China's doorstep. China wants to keep peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, and China is urging all parties concerned to bring a stop to the nuclear testing and eventually achieving nuclear denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, but also for the United States to discontinue the deployment of the THAAD anti-missile system. And I think this time also urging the United States not to take any military action unilaterally, which may result in great instability or destruction on the Korean Peninsula.
But Victor, we've just had a summit in the US between President Trump and President Xi Jinping. President Trump said he wanted to see new ideas from China, or he warned the US would act unilaterally. But we didn't see any new ideas coming from Beijing. Why not?
No, I think the Chinese government has already announced that they are sending Mr. Wu Dawei, who is the special Korean envoy, from China to Pyongyang as we speak. And he will stay there to discuss the situation with the DPRK government and try to figure out what's the best way to calm down the situation. And I would say it takes all parties to tangle together this time. Threatening to take unilateral military action is, in my best judgment, not constructive at all at this particular stage. Whatever you want to do, need to have the consensus view of various parties here in this part of the world, and South Korea need also to be consulted, and we all need to work together to create a situation where tensions on the Korean Peninsula will be reduced rather than heightened, and eventually to achieve peace and stability in this part of the world without bloodshed. Because if unilateral military action is taken, we do not know what will be the consequences of that showdown eventually.
Jean, to what extent does South Korea agree with the Chinese position? We've seen today on Monday the Chinese and South Korean envoys meeting to discuss the situation. They've agreed to tougher sanctions if we see a nuclear test or a long-range missile test. Is that the extent that Seoul is willing to go to?
One thing they do agree on, as Victor mentioned, is that they don't want another war. I mean, this region knows just how destructive and devastating the Korean War was of the 1950s, and they don't want to see that again. They do both want to be part of the discussions when it comes to finding a solution to these tensions. They don't want to be sidelined, and so that's something that they agree on. So you see all these different partners or these different players trying to forge alliances when it comes to dealing with North Korea.
Jim, does the region have a right to be alarmed, having seen the strike that the US launched against Syria? Was that a game changer? Has it raised the stakes, showing that Trump is prepared to act unilaterally?
Well, I'll give you two different but related answers. One, the strike in Syria was exceedingly modest. I mean, essentially, it was missiles that struck an empty airfield, empty airbase that then was repaired within 24 hours with bombers flying off the next day. If President Obama had done that, I assure you his Republican critics would have said it was weak and a pinprick. Now, I still think there was value in it if it deters Mr. Assad from using chemical weapons again. But it was really very, very limited. And I think it has no application to the North Korean situation at all. North Korea and Syria are completely different cases. North Korea has nuclear weapons. It has artillery aimed at Seoul. Syria doesn't have any artillery aimed at an American ally. I think they're just very different. As for where this may go, you know, I think this is basically symbolic, and Mr. Trump is risking sort of flexing muscle, and then Kim Jong-un, as he has done repeatedly in the past, may very well ignore it, call the bluff, and conduct a nuclear test or some other test. And then where are you after that? So I'm troubled by this. I think the Americans my country should at least wait until South Korea has their election before they go off on their own, trying to intimidate the North Koreans. We need a cohesive policy, and we need to have our ally on board. And there is no real president in South Korea right now, so I think this is a mistake.
Yeah, let's put that to Jean. We know we've got these elections in May, having seen the ousting of President Park. She was pretty hardline against the North. Do you think we're likely to see a continuation of that policy?
The leading candidates in this presidential race, presidential election, which is set for May 9th, are liberals. So this could certainly change the equation. Both the two candidates who are frontrunners are a little bit more open to engagement with North Korea, a little bit less inclined to rely on the U.S. for protection. So I think that we may see a shifting of alliances and positions when it comes to the Blue House in Seoul when we get a new president. Now, I do think there's quite a possibility that North Korea will try to shift public feeling or sentiment. They do want to have a liberal in the Blue House in Seoul. They want to have somebody that they feel that they can work with, and perhaps somebody who's more inclined to work with them rather than aligned with the U.S. when it comes to Korea policy.
Jean, how close is North Korea to conducting a sixth nuclear test?
From what experts are saying based on satellite imagery, they're poised and ready to go. All the preparations have been done. All that needs to be done at this point, according to the satellite imagery that we can see from above, is to get that executive order from Kim Jong-un.
Victor, what will China's response be?
No, I think China's position is consistent. China does not want to see the nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. China wants to see a stop and a discontinuation and the destruction of the nuclear weapon program by DPRK. And China is willing to work with all the parties concerned, including the United States, to achieve this goal. However, China definitely wants to have a peaceful way to solve this problem rather than to see war breaking out on the Korean Peninsula, mainly because the consequences of the start of a war on the Korean Peninsula will be highly, highly unpredictable. And you do not know, once you open that bottle, what kind of Jenny will come out of the bottle, which may eventually completely turn that part of the world upside down and spill over into countries nearby, including China. This is the last thing we can afford, and this will also be highly destructive of the United States' interest, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but in this part of the world as a whole.
Absolutely. I mean, it does seem that everyone's in agreement that you don't want to see any all-out conflict on the Korean Peninsula, that it would be hugely destabilizing for the region and indeed the world. But if North Korea does conduct a sixth nuclear test, what will China do?
Yeah, I think China is doing the right thing. China is engaging with the DPRK government. China is implementing the United Nations approved sanctions against the DPRK. And China is talking with the United States, and we want to move every party onto the same page. China has repeatedly urged that all parties come back to the six-party talk framework to talk about a peaceful solution. Right now, it's not successful, but that does not mean that we need to give up hope and go to war immediately about the DPRK nuclear weapon program, because taking military action may actually counter backfire, and eventually there will be consequences even worse than the situation it is now.
Jim, is China doing the right thing? Is it doing enough at the moment?
Well, I think it's doing some, but there is a lot more it could do. It could crack down on the private Chinese businessmen who act as brokers, who run these shell companies, who do WMD procurement for the North Koreans. So I would like to see China use its anti-corruption campaign, its anti-counterfeiting laws, and other domestic laws to go after the Chinese brokers who are helping the North Koreans. Remember, 90% of North Korea's trade is with China. China has a lot of leverage here. Now, I don't expect China to squeeze North Korea to the point of collapse. That would be a terrible idea. But there's still a lot more they could be doing. And we're going to have to see whether they actually follow through on their announcements regarding the UN Security Council resolution. They signed on to it last year, but it didn't work out. They didn't keep to the caps. They've announced this year they will stick by that cap, but we're going to have to wait and see if that's true. But there's a lot more that all the parties could be doing than they're doing right now. And finally, let me say, I do not think that the Trump administration would launch a preemptive attack anytime soon against North Korea. I think the danger here is one of miscalculation and misperception. How does Mr. Kim, sitting in Pyongyang, see these movements? Does he feel threatened? I think it's accidental war or small things that escalate rather than a deliberate massive attack by the U.S. I'm less worried about that and more worried about this other thing sort of growing out of something small.
Sure. Jean, I mean, the response to US posturing is anyone's guess, as with most things North Korea. We have seen plenty of fiery rhetoric, though, haven't we, from Pyongyang, with images of the USS Carl Vinson on fire. What are you reading from Pyongyang at the moment?
Well, one thing we should keep in mind is that Pyongyang has its own objectives as well. All of this rhetoric from Washington, these threats of preemptive military strike or leaving all options on the table, essentially gives Pyongyang, gives Kim Jong-un, it emboldens him to make that decision to continue with provocations. What we're seeing in the state media in North Korea now is that North Korea is entitled to defend itself. So it is going to use the actions in the region as justification for some sort of provocation, whether it's a nuclear test or another ballistic missile launch, one that shows that they've improved and developed their technology. I don't think it's a matter of if, it's really just a matter of when. And we've got 2 big anniversaries coming up in North Korea. These are occasions that North Korea uses. They use the tensions of the regions to build unity at home. So they're going to use the anniversaries and the tensions to bring their people together and to show them that Kim Jong-un can defend them.
Victor, does it upset Beijing? Does it upset Beijing to see Pyongyang so defiant and increasing its defiance?
Yes, of course. I think China is not happy with what DPRK is doing in terms of the nuclear testing as well as the testing of the launch vehicles. China is also more and more concerned about the increasing sophistication of the nuclear weapon system and the launch capacity of DPRK. And in this regard, China shares the concerns of the United States. On the other hand, as I emphasized just now, China is different from the United States. China wants to urge all parties concerned not to use military way to seek a solution. China wants to engage in more diplomacy, and the greater difficulty that we are experiencing on the Korean Peninsula does not mean that there is only one way out, that is to take military action, unilateral even, for example, by the United States against DPRK. That's the wrong way to do.
Sure,
and
so let's explore some other options.
People will regret that military action.
Victor did mention 6-party talks before. Jim, what is the appetite for negotiations in the US at the moment?
Well, I can report that it's low, but not dead, which I guess I'll take as good news. The Trump administration recently had a policy review, and it concluded a policy that they're going to adopt a policy of extreme pressure plus negotiation. Now, the negotiation was sort of de-emphasized, but it's in that policy. I certainly hope that the Trump administration, when they say all options are on the table, that they also include diplomacy in that, whether it's the 6-party talks or some other form. We have to keep talking to North Korea. If we don't, the risk of a mistake or a crisis, I think, grows larger.
Jean, is there any sign from Pyongyang, from Kim Jong-un, that he is willing to negotiate?
I think there have been signs, certainly. The North Koreans were very interested in what Trump had to say when he was campaigning. Of course, Trump, the candidate, is very different from Trump, the president. But I think it's notable that there was a 4-month period when there were no nuclear tests or no ballistic missiles from October to February. This was a period when they were sitting back and waiting to see what was going to happen in terms of his North Korea policy. And so there were signs then that they were open to some sort of negotiation. That said, one thing that North Korea has been very clear about is that they are not going to give up their nuclear weapons. So if denuclearization is a condition, not sure the North Koreans are going to talk.
Victor, what's your take on that? You said that the Chinese envoy is in Pyongyang or heading to Pyongyang, taking with it a message from Beijing. What's it hoping to hear in response?
No, I think philosophically speaking, I think we also need to first of all understand and then address the underlying reasons why the DPRK wants to have the nuclear weapon. They cannot eat the nuclear weapon. They want to have the nuclear weapon to keep their country safe against foreign aggression, according to their allegation. So if we follow their logic, what can we do together to make sure that they no longer have that concern? They no longer have that concern about the regime change. They no longer have that worry about a sudden attack by the United States teamed up with South Korea invading into DPRK. And I hope these actions will really not happen. And therefore, I think China is urging all parties concerned to address the fundamental issues on the Korean Peninsula so that eventually we can have greater peace and reduction of tension, and eventually both DPRK and the Republic of Korea can live peacefully with each other without nuclear weapon, and eventually even engaging in more cooperation. That's
just
the better
in the last
prospect.
minute, Jim, Obama had Asia very much on his radar with his Asia pivot. With Trump, we're seeing more of a knee-jerk reaction. Which do you think is going to play out better?
Well, I don't believe when it comes to national security you should just go by your instincts and sort of reacting to whatever happens in the environment. I would hope people have a strategy and stick to the strategy, but I fear that's not what this president is about.
You have been dealing with and aware of this threat from North Korea for a very long time. How is this different?
Well, I think it's different in part because after 8 years of watching North Korea continue to develop its nuclear and its ballistic missile capabilities, we're very close to the point where they'll be able to deliver one of those nuclear warheads to the United States. So I think the time pressure here has accelerated, and I think the risks involved, given what we've just seen in Syria, are now a little bit clearer to the Chinese than they were before. Now we've got the North threatening all kinds of dire consequences because of the U.S. decision to turn a carrier strike group around, send it back close to South Korea. That's fairly typical for North Korea. They've got a whole lexicon of threatening phrases they roll out from time to time. But honestly, just given the capabilities which our commander in South Korea has assessed the South Koreans as well, we're very close to the point where some very hard decisions have to be made.
Yeah, and to reference, this is from North Korea's official newspaper. You referenced some of their phraseology. Our revolutionary strong army is keenly watching every move by enemy elements, with our nuclear sight focused on the U.S. invasionary bases not only in South Korea and the Pacific Operation Theater, but also in the U.S. mainland. A lot of people have said Kim Jong-un is just not fully sane. I mean, you're dealing with potentially a madman who has nuclear capabilities. So how do you negotiate around that? Is it even possible?
Yeah. Well, you know, in the mainstream media, there have been articles recently explaining that Kim Jong-un really is fully rational, and in some bizarre sense, maybe he is, but not in American terms. An American politician would not kill his half-brother with VX nerve agent in a public airport, just for starters, as Kim Jong-un recently did. I don't think there's any point in negotiating with the North Koreans. On at least 4 occasions in the past 25 years, they have committed publicly to give up their nuclear weapons program in exchange for benefits that were promised to them. And in every case, they have violated their commitment, typically before the ink was dry on it. They're not going to voluntarily give up their nuclear weapons program. They're not going to voluntarily give up their ballistic missile program. I think there's only one alternative here, and that's to put enough pressure on them to have the regime collapse. The way to end the North Korean nuclear weapons program is to end North Korea. I think through reunification of the peninsula. That's something we should be talking to the Chinese about. It's going to be hard for the Chinese to accept, but they're the ones who have said for many, many years they don't want a nuclear North Korea. Here's the way to achieve it.
This morning, North Korea is looking for trouble, and he's vowing to solve the problem with or without China's help. as North Korea warns the U.S. sending any more naval forces near its shores could mean war. The U.S. on Sunday rerouted a naval strike group led by the USS Carl Vinson to the Sea of Japan. North Korea not happy about it, issuing this statement, quote, "We will take the toughest counteraction against the provocateurs in order to defend ourselves by powerful force of arms." Senior Foreign Affairs correspondent Greg Palkot is live in Seoul, South Korea. Hello, Greg.
Hi, Shannon. Yes, you're right. More tough talk coming from Pyongyang. And another show of force here in the south. Some 4,000 U.S. and South Korean troops, as well as a whole bunch of trucks and ships gathered near a South Korean coastal town for a mock landing of a lot of cargo. This is the kind of logistical backup we have been told by military officials here, crucial in any kind of offensive or defensive activity concerning North Korea. In fact, these exercises drive Pyongyang absolutely up the wall. They call them a rehearsal for war. And yes, today the regime blasted that deployment of the USS Carl Vinson strategic carrier group to this region. State television official today saying it is reckless, it is catastrophic, it is outrageous, and noting that North Korea is, yes, ready for war. It's certainly getting ready for something. Pyongyang held its annual rubber stamp parliament today. And on Saturday, the biggest date on the North Korean calendar, the anniversary of the birthday of the founder of the country, Kim Il-sung. We are expecting at least a mammoth and interesting military parade. And experts say that there could be more. The regime often uses this date to launch one of its banned missiles, and there has been activity, experts have been seeing in the last couple of weeks, around the site where it has in the past detonated a nuclear device. Another could be in the offing. In fact, today here in Seoul, South Korean officials, including its acting president, warned that the country needs to be on a heightened security alert just in case Kim Jong-un decides to try something. At the same time, in the last couple of days, Shannon, the officials here have been trying to tamp down the idea that the United States and its allies might try and stage some kind of a preemptive strike, a first strike against North Korea. Certainly an all-out war on the peninsula, unimaginable for many. Back to you.
All right, Greg Palkot live from Seoul. Thank you.